Bolivia's president faces a breaking point: nationwide protests, currency collapse, and a US-China battle for the world's largest lithium reserves. Here's what's at stake. May 16, 2026. 2,500 police and 1,000 soldiers move on the roadblocks ringing La Paz. They've been there 3 weeks. Highways blocked. Markets running out of food. La Paz, the country's executive capital, sealed off from itself. So what's brought Bolivia to this point? And why are the people calling for the president's resignation when he's been in office barely 6 months? The protesters are labor unions, indigenous federations, transport workers, neighborhood organizations, different demands, same anger. The Central Obrera Boliviana, the country's main union, is at the front. Indigenous groups that helped build the last government are marching beside them. And behind the noise, loyalists of a former president, Evo Morales, in office for 13 years until 2019, are quietly organizing the rest. They have learned the same lesson the country learned long ago. In Bolivia, you don't win arguments in parliament. You win them by shutting down the road. And right now, every road matters. The man trying to clear them just promised the country a new beginning. We'll see exactly how badly that's gone. The man behind the deployment is Rodrigo Paz, and 6 months ago, his election was supposed to fix everything. Paz won in 2025 by the narrowest margin Bolivia had seen in a generation. He ended 20 years of left-wing rule under the Movimiento al Socialismo, the party of Evo Morales, the party that built modern Bolivia and ran it into the ground. His pitch was simple. The old model had run out of money. The currency peg was crumbling. Fuel was vanishing from petrol stations. Foreign reserves were almost gone. Paz promised market reform, opening Bolivia to foreign investment, and killing the subsidies that were burning through what little hard currency remained. The voters who put him in office knew the medicine would hurt. They didn't know how much. Within weeks of taking office, he declared an economic emergency, and the people who had voted for change started building the barricades. Because the reforms he promised had to come out of someone's pocket. Pretty soon, the country was about to learn whose. Watch the top line collapse. Bolivia's foreign exchange reserves fell from $12 billion in 2015 to just $141 million by late 2025, roughly enough to cover imports for 3 days. Gold reserves held steady, but you can't pay for diesel with gold bars. When this number hits zero, the currency peg dies, and prices everywhere explode. With reserves down to days, Paz had one lever left, and on December 17, 2025, he pulled it. He declared an economic emergency and killed the fuel subsidy. The subsidy had been untouched since 2005, 20 years of cheap petrol propping up the cost of living for the poorest country in South America. Here's how the trap worked. Bolivia's own oil production was falling. International oil prices were rising. The government bought imported fuel at world prices and sold it at the same low pump price it had set in 2005, making up the difference out of those vanishing dollar reserves. Every liter of diesel sold was burning down the central bank. Ending the subsidy freed the reserves. It also tripled the cost of getting to work for a taxi driver in El Alto and a farmer trucking potatoes to market. The transport unions hit the streets first. The unions that had voted for Paz turned on him within months. And then, everyone else followed, fighting for a country that's supposed to be rich. It is supposed to be rich. Bolivia sits on 23 million tons of lithium, the largest reserves on Earth. The metal that powers every electric car on the road and every phone charging on your nightstand right now. And yet, in the first 9 months of 2025, Bolivia produced just 1,668 tons. Argentina, next door, mined over 100,000. The chemistry is brutal. Bolivia's salt flats are full of magnesium, which makes battery-grade lithium expensive and slow to extract. The politics were worse. Under the previous government, China and Russia signed roughly $2 billion in contracts to develop the lithium. A court in the Potosi department ordered the projects suspended, citing transparency concerns, environmental risk, and the suspicion that foreign firms were getting too much of a strategic resource. The deals froze. The lithium stayed in the ground. Then, in April 2026, Paz signed a critical minerals agreement with Washington. 20 years of MAS rule had pointed Bolivia toward Beijing. Paz turned the country around in a single signature, which is exactly why the streets exploded. The streets exploded because Paz is changing more than economic policy. He's tearing up the political settlement that has held Bolivia together for 20 years. Data shows political stability risk in Bolivia is at its highest point in years, and the reason isn't only the protests. It's who's organizing them. Evo Morales has been out of office since 2019. But his networks, the labor federations, the coca growers' unions, the indigenous community organizations he built power around, never went away. They are the same networks that brought Morales to the presidency in 2006, and they're moving again. The Central Arbora Boliviana is in the streets. Indigenous federations that built MAS are in the streets. Even Paz's own vice president, Edmund Lara, is reportedly clashing with him behind the scenes. The reforms might be the right medicine, but Paz won by a sliver. His coalition is thin, and the people opposing him have done this before. They have the playbook for bringing a Bolivian government down, and they wrote it themselves. So the obvious question becomes, are we watching 2019 all over again? It looks like 2019 all over again. It isn't, and that might be worse. In October 2019, Evo Morales ran for a 4th term, and the election was a mess. The Organization of American States documented fraud. The European Union backed up the finding. Morales resigned within weeks and fled into exile, and the country split. Half called it a coup. The other half called it the Constitution working. The fight was about who legitimately won, about counting machines and ballot stuffing, and whether the man at the top had stolen another 5 years. That kind of crisis has a fix. You hold another election. You let the courts rule. You count the votes again. This time, the fight isn't about a stolen election. It's about empty petrol stations, about prices that doubled in 6 months, about the dollars that aren't there to import the things people need to live. You can recount an election. You can't recount the central bank, which means this crisis doesn't end with a vote. And it might not end inside Bolivia at all. It might not end inside Bolivia at all. Look at the neighbors. Argentina is fighting its own currency war. Inflation tearing through wages. Peso pressure relentless. Dollar reserves bleeding for years. Peru is wrestling with falling mineral exports and political churn that has burned through 6 presidents in 6 years. The Andean region is running the same economic experiment at the same time. Commodity-dependent economies, rigid currency arrangements, governments trying to cut spending without losing the streets. If Bolivia's peg breaks, capital looks at Argentina and Peru and asks the obvious question, who's next? Investors don't wait for the answer. They pull money out first, ask later. A single disorderly devaluation in La Paz could trigger pressure across three currencies, push inflation higher in all three, and topple governments that are already hanging by a thread. The lithium, the copper, the natural gas, the Andes feed an enormous slice of the global commodity supply. A crisis here doesn't stay regional for long, which leaves Paz with a choice no Bolivian president has faced in a decade. It leaves Paz with a choice no Bolivian president has faced in a decade. 3 paths, 90 days. Path 1, Paz cuts a deal. He has already repealed the land reform bill that lit the initial fuse. He could trade more concessions for labor peace, devalue the currency in a managed step, and ride the storm long enough for the lithium investment to start paying. The reforms survive. The peg dies softly. Path 2, the military steps in. The 500 police and 1,000 soldiers Paz deployed in May were sent to clear the roads. If political control fragments further, those same forces have other options, and Bolivia's history with military intervention is long and recent. Path 3, the morales networks finish what they started. The unions and indigenous federations build the protests until Paz either bends completely or resigns, and a MAS-aligned successor takes back the palace. 20 years of left-wing rule resume, and the new agreement with Washington goes straight back in the drawer. 3 paths, 1 country, and the rest of the world watching the salt flats. The rest of the world is watching the salt flats because every electric car of the next decade rolls through here. Bolivia holds the largest lithium reserves on the planet, and right now its central bank has enough dollars for 3 days of imports. That contradiction, vast underground wealth and visible institutional collapse, is the story of the energy transition in miniature. The metals are in places where governments are thin and politics is fragile. The countries holding the keys to the green economy can't always afford to keep the lights on. So pull the threads together. A narrow election ended 20 years of left-wing rule. The reforms that followed broke the subsidies that had bought social peace. The reserves ran down to almost nothing. The streets came back, and whoever ends up holding La Paz will decide whether Washington or Beijing gets the lithium that powers the next decade. The politics of who controls the metals of the green transition isn't being settled in boardrooms in Brussels or Detroit. It's being settled on a blocked highway outside La Paz. And the next 3 months will tell us who's winning. The next 90 days could reshape South American politics and the global energy transition. If you found this breakdown valuable, like and share it with friends who follow geopolitics. Subscribe to stay ahead of tomorrow's crisis. See you tomorrow.